The rain didn't fall in drops. It fell in sheets, blurring the neon signs of the city into jagged streaks of pink and blue. Ifeyinwa's chest burned with every ragged breath. Her sneakers hit the pavement with a wet, heavy slap that sounded far too loud in the narrow alleyway. Behind her, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots was gaining. He was gaining. She didn't look back. She knew the look on his face, that jagged, frantic pride that wouldn't let her go. Her fingers, numb from the cold, brushed against a row of parked cars. Most were locked tight, fortresses of metal and glass. Then, her hand hit the handle of a matte black sedan. It gave. She slipped inside like a ghost, pulling the door shut with a click that felt like a gunshot in the silence of the cabin. She threw herself onto the floorboards of the back seat, curling into a ball, her forehead pressed against the plush floor mat. She smelled expensive leather, sandalwood, and the faint, sharp tang of gun oil. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, her eyes squeezed shut. "Just a minute. Just give me 1 minute." Outside, the heavy boots slowed. A shadow fell across the tinted window, obscuring the dim streetlights. Ifeyinwa pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, her heart drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The shadow lingered, a predator sensing movement, before finally moving on. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was heavy, pressing. "You're bleeding on the floor mats." The voice was a low, melodic baritone, devoid of surprise or anger. Ifeyinwa froze. She hadn't even looked at the driver's seat. Slowly, she lifted her head. Through the gap between the front seats, she saw him. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring straight ahead through the windshield, one hand draped casually over the steering wheel. The cuff of his charcoal suit moved back just enough to reveal the black ink of a tattoo, a dragon's tail winding around his wrist. I'm sorry," she rasped, her voice cracking. "I just needed to hide. I'll go." As she reached for the handle, the soft thunk of the electronic locks echoed through the car. "He's still standing at the end of the block," the man said, his eyes tracking something in the rearview mirror. He finally turned his head. His jaw was a sharp line of granite, his eyes dark and unsettlingly calm. He looked at her not with pity, but with a detached, clinical interest. "If you go out there now, he'll catch you. If you stay in here, you owe me a cleaning fee." He paused, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "And I am very expensive to owe." Ifeyinwa looked at the locks, then back at the man. She realized then that she hadn't escaped the danger. She had simply traded a storm for an abyss. The silhouette of the man outside remained etched against the rain-slicked window, a dark smudge of persistent malice. Ifeyinwa stayed crouched on the floorboards, her fingers digging into the leather upholstery. She watched the back of the driver's head, immobile, regal, and terrifyingly still. "Stay down," Do-yoon commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an architectural fact. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached for a slim, silver phone in the center console. He tapped a single button, his thumb hovering over the glass as he watched the side mirror. Outside, the ex-partner had turned back. He was walking toward the car again, emboldened by the lack of movement, his hand reaching out to test the very handle Ifeyinwa had used to enter. The handle rattled. The car didn't budge. Do-yoon finally rolled down the window, but only an inch. A sliver of the cold, wet night air sliced into the warm cabin. "Is there a problem?" Do-yoon asked. His voice didn't rise to meet the sound of the rain. It cut through it. "My girl," the man outside barked, his voice ragged with a desperate kind of bravado. "She's in there. Open the door, man. This don't involve you." Do-yoon didn't look at him. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching Ife-Inwa's wide, amber eyes in the reflection. He held her gaze for a second, a silent, heavy bridge of understanding, before returning his attention to the window. "Nothing in this car belongs to you," Do-yoon said softly, "including the air you're currently wasting." The man outside began to shout, his face pressing against the glass, but Do-yoon simply brought the phone to his ear. "Intersection of 4th and Main," he said into the receiver, his tone bored. "A stray dog is barking at my door. Remove it." Before the man outside could react, 2 black SUVs surged from the shadows of the nearby alleyway, their tires screaming against the asphalt. They pinned the man against a brick wall, lights blinding him. 4 men in dark, sharp coats stepped out. They didn't draw guns. They didn't need to. Their presence alone turned the ex-partner's aggression into a visible, trembling puddle of fear. One of them looked toward the sedan and bowed deeply. Do-yoon rolled the window up. The silence returned, vacuum-sealed and heavy. Outside, the men led Ife-Inwa's past away into the dark, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. "He won't be back," Do-yoon said, finally shifting the car into gear. Ife-Inwa found her voice, though it felt like she was swallowing glass. "Who are you?" He steered the car away from the curb, the engine a low, predatory hum. "The man who just bought your debt," he replied. "Sit up, Ife-Inwa. The floor is no place for a guest." The car glided through the city's veins like a shark in dark water. Ife-Inwa climbed onto the leather seat, her body trembling with a delayed adrenaline spike. She watched the cityscape shift. The familiar crumbling brick of her neighborhood gave way to the sterile, intimidating glass of the central district. Here, the lights weren't neon and flickering. They were steady, white, and expensive. Do-yoon drove with a terrifying precision, his eyes never leaving the road, yet he seemed to perceive everything. He didn't ask her for her name. He had already spoken it. That realization settled in her gut like lead. He knew who she was before she had even stopped shaking. They pulled into the underground garage of a spire that seemed to touch the low-hanging rain clouds. The air here was different, climate-controlled, smelling of ozone and polished stone. As the car came to a halt, the heavy steel gates hissed shut behind them, sealing out the world. "Out," Do-yoon said. It wasn't a threat, just a fact. When she stepped out, she wasn't met by the police or a social worker. She was met by a line of men in identical black suits, their hands folded in front of them, their heads bowed in a synchronized display of absolute fealty. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a loaded gun. Do-yoon walked past them without a word, his coat billowing slightly. Ife-Inwa hurried to keep pace, her simple streetwear and scuffed sneakers feeling like a loud confession of her vulnerability in this palace of cold stone. They entered a private elevator. There were no buttons, only a biometric scanner that hummed as it read Do-yoon's palm. As they ascended, the glass wall of the elevator revealed the city sprawling below. From this height, the streets where she had spent her life running looked like a messy, insignificant grid. "You think you are safe because the man who chased you is gone," Do-yoon said, his reflection in the glass standing tall and predatory over her shoulder. "But safety is an expensive illusion, Ife-Inwa." The doors slid open to a penthouse that felt more like a command center than a home. Screens lined one wall, flickering with silent security feeds from across the city. On a mahogany table sat a traditional Korean tea set next to a handgun stripped for cleaning. Ife-Inwa looked at the ink curling up his neck, then at the cold, calculating luxury of the room. This wasn't a hiding spot. It was a throne room. The man who had saved her didn't work for the law. He was the law that the law was afraid of. "You're a boss," she whispered, the realization finally anchoring in her mind. Do-yoon walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at his kingdom. "I am the man who ensures that in this city, nothing happens without my permission, including your survival." Do-yoon moved to the mahogany table, his movements fluid and disturbingly graceful. He poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons that vanished into the shadows of the high ceiling. He didn't offer her a seat, and Yinhua didn't take one. She stood by the glass, feeling the vibration of the wind against the skyscraper, realizing how high she had climbed and how far she had to fall. "Drink," he said, sliding a ceramic cup toward the edge of the table. "Your blood pressure is bottoming out. I don't need you fainting on the Italian marble." Yinhua approached the table with hesitant steps. She didn't touch the tea. "Why did you help me? Men like you don't pull over for strangers unless they want something." Do-yoon finally looked at her, his dark eyes unblinking. "You think your ex-boyfriend was just a man with a bad temper? You think you were running from a domestic dispute?" He leaned back, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal figure against the city lights. "Samuel didn't just lose his mind, Yinhua. He lost $500,000 of my investors' money." The name of her ex hit her like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. He told me he was a promoter. He said the money was for a club." "Samuel is a gambler who uses other people's blood as collateral," Do-yoon said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade's edge. "He didn't come after you tonight because he loves you. He came after you because he told the people he owes that you were his insurance. He traded your life for a week's extension on his own." Yinhua's hand flew to her throat. The protection she thought she had found felt suddenly like a different kind of noose. She wasn't a girl who had been saved. She was a piece of property that had just been recovered by its rightful owner. "So I'm just a debt to be collected?" she asked, her voice trembling but her eyes remaining fierce. Do-yoon stood up, walking toward her until he was inches away. He was a different kind of cold, not the biting winter of the streets, but the deep, eternal freeze of the deep sea. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw where a faint bruise was beginning to bloom. "In my world, everything has a price," he murmured. "Samuel cannot pay. That leaves you. You are a collateral interest now, Yinhua. You stay under my roof, under my shadow, until I decide what your life is worth." He turned away, leaving her standing in the center of the vast, silent room. "Don't look so terrified. You wanted space to breathe? I've given it to you. Just remember who owns the air." The days in the penthouse passed in a blur of forced stillness. For the first time in years, Yinhua didn't have to jump at the sound of a door slamming, yet the silence was its own kind of weight. She found Do-yoon in the library long after the city's lights had begun to flicker into their midnight rhythm. He was no longer the armored titan in the charcoal suit. He wore a robe of heavy black silk, left loosely open, the fabric pooling around him like spilled ink. He was focused on his arm, a cotton swab in his hand, dabbing at a jagged, fresh laceration that ran across his forearm, a souvenir from a meeting he hadn't mentioned. As he moved, the silk slid further down his shoulder, revealing the true map of his life. The tattoos were breathtaking, intricate traditional irizumi that climbed his spine and coiled around his ribs. But as Yinhua stepped closer, she realized the ink wasn't just art, it was a veil. It moved over and around raised ridges of skin, thick silver lines of scar tissue that no amount of pigment could fully hide. There was a puckered mark on his shoulder from a bullet, and a long, thin slice near his collarbone that mirrored the one she carried on her own ribs. Do-yun didn't look up, but his hand stilled. "I told you to sleep, Ife-Inwa." "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice sounding small in the vast room. "It's a hazard of the trade." He finally turned, his eyes tired, the predatory edge softened by the dim amber light. He watched her eyes track the scars on his chest. "Does it shock you that the man who owns the city can still be cut?" Ife-Inwa moved closer, reaching out an impulsive hand before stopping herself. "No, it makes me realize why you're so quiet. You aren't just powerful, you're surviving too." Do-yun looked down at his arm, then back at her. For a fleeting second, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing a man who had traded every piece of his peace for the power to keep others out. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers grazing the sleeve of her shirt, right where he knew her own scars were hidden. "We are different kinds of monsters, you and I," he murmured, his thumb catching the pulse at her wrist. "The world tried to break us both. The only difference is, I decided to break the world back." In that quiet, sterile room, the distance between the captive and the captor narrowed. She saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, a reflection of her own soul-deep weariness. He wasn't just her protection, he was a mirror. He let the silk fall back into place, closing the curtain on his history, but the image remained burned into her mind. He was a man built of wounds, held together by sheer, terrifying will. The crash was not the sound of breaking glass. It was the roar of a concussive blast that shook the very bones of the skyscraper. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, designed to withstand hurricanes, spiderwebbed into 1,000 glittering diamonds before imploding inward. Ife-Inwa was thrown against the kitchen island, the wind knocked out of her. Through the smoke and the sudden screaming wind of the high altitude, she saw the red dancing dots of laser sights sweeping across the room. These weren't Samuel's desperate thugs. These were professionals. "Get down!" Do-yun's voice barked through the haze. He was already moving, a shadow among shadows. He flipped the heavy mahogany table with a strength born of pure adrenaline, creating a makeshift barrier. He fired 2 rounds from the handgun he had been cleaning just hours before, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face, set in a mask of cold, lethal focus. From her position behind the marble counter, Ife-Inwa saw what Do-yun couldn't. A second team was breaching through the service elevator behind him. The smoke was thicker there, swirling around the black-clad figures raising suppressed submachine guns toward Do-yun's exposed back. Her instinct was to curl into a ball, to disappear as she had done 1,000 times before. Her lungs hitched, the familiar paralyzing terror of being trapped, clawing at her throat. But then she saw the blood on Do-yun's silk robe, the bandage from his earlier wound soaking through. If he died, she wasn't just free. She was a sitting duck for whoever was coming through that door. She reached out, her hand landing on a heavy, decorative bronze sculpture on the counter. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Hide or help? She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. Ife-Inwa slid across the slick floor, moving with the quiet grace of a girl who had spent a lifetime learning how not to be noticed. As the first assassin stepped from the elevator, leveling his weapon at the back of Do-yun's head, Ife-Inwa rose like a ghost from the smoke. She didn't have a gun, but she had the element of absolute insignificance. She slammed the bronze weight into the side of the man's temple with every ounce of her trauma-fueled rage. As he crumpled, she grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and pulled the pin. flooding the hallway with a blinding white cloud of chemicals. The distraction gave Do-yoon the 3 seconds he needed. He spun, his weapon barking twice, dropping the remaining threats with clinical precision. Silence returned, save for the whistling wind and the distant wail of sirens. Do-yoon stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving. He looked at the fallen assassin at Lee Fei-inwa's feet, then at the girl herself, covered in white dust, trembling, but standing tall. "I told you to hide," he said, his voice strained. "I'm tired of hiding," she rasped, dropping the bronze statue. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Do-yoon walked over, his eyes searching hers. For the first time, he didn't look at her as collateral. He looked at her as a survivor. "Then stop," he said softly. "Help me finish this." The penthouse was a skeletal ruin of its former luxury, the wind howling through the shattered glass like a restless spirit. Do-yoon sat in the center of the wreckage, his laptop glowing against the dim light, surrounded by a mountain of digital blueprints and encrypted call logs. His lieutenants stood in the shadows, their faces tight with a suspicion that tasted like copper. Someone had opened the service elevator. Someone had deactivated the biometric floor lock. "They are looking for a digital signature," Lee Fei-inwa said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She was wrapped in a borrowed oversized sweater, her curls dusted with the white powder of the extinguisher. Do-yoon didn't look up, but his fingers paused over the keys. "My security team is the best in Seoul. If there was a trace, they would have found it." "They're looking for a wolf," she countered, walking toward the monitors. "But you were hit by a ghost, someone who knows how to be invisible." She gestured toward the screen displaying the supply chain logs for the building's maintenance. "In my neighborhood back home, if you wanted to move something without the local lords knowing, you didn't use the main roads. You used the people who blend into the walls." She pointed to a recurring entry for a laundry service that serviced the building at odd hours, times that didn't align with the penthouse's schedule. "Look at the weights. Every Tuesday, the outgoing linens weigh 30 pounds more than the incoming. That's not laundry. That's hardware." Do-yoon's eyes sharpened. He signaled one of his men, who quickly pulled up the personnel files for the laundry contractors. Lee Fei-inwa leaned in, her gaze scanning the names and faces with a predatory stillness. She wasn't looking at their records, she was looking at their eyes, searching for the specific flicker of desperate greed she had seen in Samuel 1,000 times. "There," she whispered, tapping a grainy photo of a young man with a nervous set to his jaw. "He's not a soldier. He's a runner. He doesn't want to kill you. He just wants to be rich enough to stop being afraid." Do-yoon tracked the name, a cousin of his own head of logistics. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. The betrayal wasn't coming from a rival. It was coming from the heart of his own house. He turned his chair toward her, the blue light of the screen casting sharp, jagged shadows across his features. He looked at her not as a debt, but as an asset, a woman who saw the world's cracks because she had lived inside them. "The Nigerian ghost," he murmured, a trace of genuine respect coloring his tone. "You see the things I've become too powerful to notice." "Power makes you a target, Do-yoon," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "Being a ghost makes you a survivor." He stood, the silk of his robe rustling. "Then let's go hunting. I want to see if your intuition holds when the blood starts to spill." The warehouse at the edge of the dock smelled of salt, rotted wood, and the cold metallic tang of impending violence. Do-yoon had used the laundry runner as bait, feeding a false location to the mole, but the trap had a secondary jaw that Lee Fei-inwa hadn't expected. As the heavy steel doors groaned open, the floodlights flickered on, revealing a jagged line of men in gray suits, the rivals who had been hunting Du Yun's throne. But standing at the center, looking small and frantic in a jacket that didn't belong to him, was Samuel. Ife Yinhua's breath hitched. Seeing him here, in this temple of shadows, made her past feel like a grotesque stain on her present. Samuel looked at her, his eyes darting with a pathetic, manic energy. He wasn't a partner anymore. He was a leash held by the man standing behind him, a scarred enforcer with a blade resting against Samuel's shoulder. "You really moved up in the world, Iffy," Samuel called out, his voice cracking. "From a basement apartment to a Mafia king's lap? I told them you were worth the trouble. I told them you were the key." Do Yun stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a blade tucked into his waistband. He didn't look at the gunman, he looked only at Samuel. "You sold her once to settle a debt," Do Yun said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "You brought my enemies to my door to settle another. You are a man who has run out of currency." "I have her!" Samuel screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Ife Yinhua. "She knows your patterns. She knows your penthouse. She's the collateral." The rival boss stepped out from the shadows, a sneer twisting his face. "Give us the shipping codes for the northern docks, Do Yun, and you can take your little ghost and this piece of trash and leave. If not, the girl stays. We'll see how much she's worth to you after a few nights in our care." Ife Yinhua felt the familiar cold of terror, but this time, it didn't paralyze her. She looked at Do Yun. He was perfectly still, a predator calculating the wind. He didn't look back at her, but she felt the weight of his trust in the way he stood. He wasn't shielding her. He was waiting for her to move. She realized then that the trap wasn't just for the rivals. It was for her fear. "Samuel," Ife Yinhua said, her voice steady, echoing in the cavernous space. "You always said I was lucky to have you, that I'd be nothing without your protection." She took a step toward the line of guns, her eyes locked on her ex. "But look at us now. You're the one on your knees, and I'm the one standing next to the man who's going to end you." The shift in the room was palpable. The rivals hesitated, confused by the lack of fear in the woman they thought was a pawn. Do Yun's hand moved, a flash of silver in the dim light. "The parley is over," he murmured. The warehouse erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. The flash of muzzle fire illuminated the crates in jagged bursts of white, but Ife Yinhua didn't dive for cover this time. She moved through the shadows she had once used for hiding, now using them as a bridge. While Do Yun's men engaged the rivals, she kept her eyes on the center of the storm. Samuel had broken free in the confusion, scrambling toward a stack of rusted barrels, his eyes wide with the frantic, cornered energy of a rat. He saw her coming, not running, but walking with a terrifying, deliberate calm. He reached into his waistband and pulled a small, snub-nosed revolver, his hand shaking so violently the barrel tapped against the metal of a crate. "Stay back, Iffy!" he shrieked, the bravado from moments ago replaced by a shrill, pathetic desperation. "I'll do it! I swear to God I'll end this right now!" Ife Yinhua didn't stop. She didn't flinch. The sound of gunfire echoed around them, but in the small circle of their confrontation, there was only the sound of her footsteps. She looked at the man who had occupied her nightmares, the man who had made her feel like a ghost in her own skin. He looked small. He looked weak. The god of her private hell was just a coward with a piece of cold steel. "You won't," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to flatten the noise of the room. Because to pull that trigger, You have to look at me. And you've never really looked at me, Samuel. You only looked at what you could take from me." She was 5 feet away. Then 3. The gun was pointed directly at her chest. Behind her, she sensed a presence. A dark, silent shadow. Do-yoon was there, a ghost at her shoulder, his own weapon held at his side. He wasn't intervening. He was standing guard over her agency. He was giving her the silence she needed to finish it. Samuel looked from the gun to her eyes, and then past her to the obsidian gaze of the man who truly owned the darkness. His spirit broke. The revolver clattered to the concrete floor, a hollow, tinny sound. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, collapsing onto his knees. "Ife, please. I was just trying to survive." Ife Inwa looked down at him, her face as unreadable as a stone carving. She felt no surge of triumph, only a profound, cooling relief. The fear that had lived in the marrow of her bones for years simply evaporated, leaving behind a clean, hard strength. "I survived you," she said softly. She didn't wait for his response. She turned her back on him, the ultimate act of dismissal, and looked at Do-yoon. He lowered his head in a slow, solemn nod of recognition. The weapon in her hand wasn't a gun or a blade. It was the fact that he no longer had the power to make her blink. The warehouse fell into a heavy, ringing stillness. The rivals had been neutralized, and Samuel had been dragged into the cold morning air to face a reckoning that Ife Inwa no longer cared to witness. Outside, the sun was beginning to bleed through the gray smog of the docks, painting the puddles in shades of bruised purple and gold. Do-yoon's black sedan sat idling near the pier, its exhaust a soft, rhythmic plume of white in the chill. He stood by the open driver's side door, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with oil and smoke. He looked at the city skyline, then at her. "There is a boat leaving for the coast in an hour," he said, his voice stripped of its usual command, leaving only a raw, quiet honesty. From there, a plane. New identity, a clean record, and enough credit to ensure you never have to look at a man like me again. The debt of blood is settled, Ife Inwa. You are free. He reached into his pocket and held out a small, leather-bound passport. It was the space to breathe she had been searching for since she first stepped foot in this country. It was safety, without the shadow of a Mafia throne. Ife Inwa looked at the passport, then at the man holding it. She thought of the girl who had crawled into the back seat of a stranger's car, trembling and broken. That girl was gone. The woman standing on the docks now knew how to spot a mole, how to hold a gaze, and how to survive the dark. "I've spent my whole life running toward a clean life," she said, her voice steady against the wind. "But the clean life is where people like Samuel hide in plain sight. At least here, I can see the monsters coming." She walked past the hand holding the passport and moved toward the car. She didn't head for the back seat. She opened the front passenger door and sat down, the leather familiar and warm. Do-yoon remained still for a heartbeat, a flicker of something, surprise, or perhaps relief, crossing his sharp features. He tucked the passport away and climbed into the driver's seat beside her. "If you stay," he murmured, looking at her through the reflection of the windshield, "you won't be a guest, and you won't be collateral. You'll be part of the foundation. My world is violent, Ife Inwa. It is demanding." I know, she replied, leaning her head back against the headrest. She looked at him, not as a savior, and not as a master, but as an equal partner in a dangerous dance. But I'm done hiding in the back. If we're going to run this city, I want to see the road ahead. Do-yoon didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed. He shifted the car into gear. They drove away from the docks, moving not away from the danger, but directly into the heart of it.